I want to talk about this issue with sex in the Bible. You know, I want to thank everyone who helped us move this week. We got moved in yesterday, and I do thank everyone who helped us not only yesterday, but the moving out of our other house and just that transition. We're finally in. It was so nice to sleep in our own bed and just your own space, and you know what that's like. Well, with that in mind, I'd been thinking about some things that we've done this week. You know, we've been painting and putting in new light fixtures and that kind of stuff. And you know what it's like. And some of you might be like me. I'm the kind of person that when I get a box and has stuff in it, I just open up the box, I look at all the stuff, and I go, oh, I can figure this out. I can just put this here, put that there, put this screw in. And there's always something in there, and I just go, I don't need that, right? And so I throw the instructions off to the side, and I just start working on it. Well, this week I did that to a light. I thought, man, I have put up dozens of light fixtures. I surely can put this one up. Well, 30 minutes later, after I about lost my Christianity, I finally decided, all right, I need to look at the paperwork here. And I started reading through, and it showed how to run these wires a certain way that I couldn't quite figure out. Anyway, I finally got it together. The problem was I didn't want to pay attention to the instructions. Now, just so I don't feel like I'm by myself, and so you guys do not lie in church because God can see you, okay? You know He can. How many of you guys are like me and you don't look at instructions, you just do it on your own? All right, yes. We need a recovery group for us, right? For us guys recovering from like a lack of instructions. You know, we don't use instructions, you know. We need to use instructions because sometimes instructions are very, very important. Sometimes they keep us safe. Sometimes they make the product better. They make it function right. It does things we don't think that we could do. I remember a while back, I got a book when I got an iPhone. My brother gave me his old iPhone. It was a third generation, iPhone 3 or whatever, you know, and I was all excited. And he gave me this book, iPhone 3 for Dummies. I don't know what he was trying to say about me, but that book was like this thick. And about all I could do when I got that iPhone was I just barely had learned how to text, and I could make some calls and stuff like that. And that book showed me how many other things that phone could do. And so it's worth reading the instructions. When it comes to this issue, folks, I think it's very much the same way. Many of us are just so eager to get to the end results that we bypass the instructions. And I think with the issue of sex, there's so many people who are so eager to get to the end result that we bypass the instruction book, the instruction manual, which, by the way, is called the Bible. All right? We live in a world today where we don't think that that's necessary, but it is. I think that one of the problems that we have is that we live in a sex-crazed world. A sex-crazed world. And so I began thinking about this a couple weeks ago, that you know what? God has something to say about the issue of sex, and we need to talk about it. You don't have to be a PhD to realize that our media content and the sexual content of our media is spiraling out of control. I've spent a great part this week doing some research on statistics and that deal with sex and sexuality and stuff like that. And I just got to share with you a minute to kind of lighten the mood a little bit, because no one is more uncomfortable in this room right now than me, I assure you, okay? And when I preached this morning, my children were in the audience as well. So let's just relax about it. But my in-laws and Michelle came and they picked me up for lunch, and we went to lunch, and I was talking to Michelle. We were sitting down, and I wasn't even trying to be funny. I wasn't trying to be my normal stupid self, but I was sitting there, and I said, I had just been reading about sex statistics for hours and hours now, and I am tired, and honestly, I really do just have a headache. So just reading about it made me tired and gave me a headache, all right? So I knew some of you would enjoy that, a little bit of humor there, okay? So now we can go a little bit deeper right into the text issue. Let me tell you some of the stuff I came across here. In an article dated in September of 2012 in Pastor.com, it said that movies released from 1950 to 2006 were reviewed, a series of them. I can't remember how, 600 some different movies, kind of randomly selected. 85% of them contain sexual content. And we're not talking just R-rated films, which was 88%, but 68% of G-rated films had sexual content, 82% of PG-rated films, and 85% of PG-13 rated films. I never would have thought that those numbers would have been that high, especially like G-rated films. A lot of Disney-type films and whatever, I was reading through there, and they would start describing the situation. I'm like, yeah, I watched that, and it didn't even sink in because we are so used to it anymore. But I'm thinking, wow, it really was there. 57% of U.S. adolescents ages between 14 and 16 report that they use media as a primary source for sexual information. That surprised me. That in those formative years, when hormones are raging, when the ability to be off secretly by yourself and with your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, that the information that they're finding out about sex, primarily 57%, come from the media source. That's not where I want my children learning about this issue. The website Teen Health and Media reported that 2 out of every 3 TV shows include sexual content in our world today. And furthermore, sexual intercourse was either depicted or strongly suggested in 1 out of every 10 TV shows. The website No Bullying, that deals with that issue of bullying and struggles and stuff in school, reported on the issue of sexting. I don't know if any of you know what that is. I know our youth know what that is. You know, it's where now that we have mobile devices, we can just click a picture and stuff. Now the issue is we're clicking nude photos of one another and sending them to our boyfriends, girlfriends, and that kind of stuff there. The No Bullying website said that 24% of high school teenagers have been involved in sexting. That's ages between 14 and 17 years old. Said they've sent nude photos via a mobile device to another person. Most of the time, they didn't know generally who the other person was. That was scary. 33% of college-age students had sent nude photos to one another. The Kinsey Institute, some of you know about them. That's all they deal with is in sexual research from the 60s and on. It reported that by the age of 17, we're talking a junior in high school here, by the age of 17, 46% of boys and 49% of girls have experienced sexual intercourse. By the age of 17. 1 out of every 8 Google searches is dealing with erotic content. 66% of HR professionals have found pornography on employee computers. The average age of boys exposed to pornography in the United States now is age 11. We're talking like a 5th grader here. Our world is spiraling out of control when it comes to the issue of sexuality. We live in a world where sex and the images of sex are all around us. The ease by which a person can gain access to explicit images has never been easier and more free. Even decades ago, you had to go to the outskirts of a town, to some rundown, dingy bookstore that no one would speak about, where now we live in a world where in the quiet and secret lives of sexual addiction can flow into a person's life because they have the access to the internet or to the computer or on their mobile device all by themselves where no one sees what's going on. Now we live in a world where sex and issues of sex are spoken about openly. You only need to turn on your computer, your TV, type a word into a Google search, into your smartphone, and a whole world of sinfulness is right there at your fingertips. We're never going to go back. The genie is never going to get put back in the bottle. And so we need to deal with this issue. I believe that one of the problems with all of the sex information and stuff that we have today is that with the millions of voices that are speaking about this issue, there is one voice that is not being heard, and that is the voice of God. That is the voice of God. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I can remember that sex was not talked about in the church where I grew up in. Yes, my youth minister had some topics on it a little bit. It was never really dealing with the issues that we honestly were dealing with at the time, but I honestly can say that I never ever remember it being mentioned from the pulpit. I heard lots of good sermons about Joseph. I heard great sermons about Moses. I heard sermons about sin. I heard sermons about coming to Jesus. I heard sermons about baptism, but I never heard a sermon that honestly dealt with the issues of sex or sexuality. In fact, it was just kind of quieted down. And I think it was because too many churchgoers and maybe even too many preachers thought that the topic of sex was too risque for a Sunday morning church service. We shied away from using sexual terms, fearing that the mention or the topic of sex would encourage lustful or immoral activities. I remember having some elders say, we don't want to talk about that because then we're just going to encourage the kids to do it. I'm thinking they're already doing this, whether you talk about it or not. The fact is that God's word speaks on such topic. The church needs to be the voice that speaks louder than the world on this issue. We have the problems where we have partly become in the society that we are because we have not been courageous enough to speak on the issue. So let me just say that sex is God's issue. It's not man's issue. But Satan has taken a wonderful thing, he has perverted it to the point that it is seen as evil and vile. And I believe that it's time that we stop fearing, that we stop shying away from the topic, and that we speak about it in honest terms. That we not make it embarrassing, that we not make it an act to shy away from, but that we talk about it as the wonderful gift of God that it is. Simply put, sex in the Bible, yes, God has something to say about it. And we're going to talk about it today. Now, I don't mean to embarrass you. I'm going to speak very frankly about some words, very honestly. It's not like it's things you haven't heard before. I do not intend to be crude. I probably will lighten the moment a little bit because we all need to have a break from time to time. So, if we can do that, you ready to kind of follow along with me? Please say yes. All right. My kids are not in the audience, but they said, Dad, do not use this as a sermon illustration. I said, believe me, I'm not going to use you as a sermon illustration for the next several weeks. Because honestly, what do you have to add to this topic? I said, if you do, there's a bigger problem, okay? So I'm not going to use. I told them I wouldn't use them and I won't embarrass them. But I said, nothing about embarrassing myself, all right? I tend to do that quite often. You have a little insert in your bulletin. I'd like for you to follow along. And I'd also like to tell you this. At the end of each sermon, there's 4 questions. I'll put 3 or 4 questions on there. Parents, I want you to take these and I want you to talk to your students about them. I want you to talk to your children about age-appropriate stuff, okay? You need to talk to them about it. The statistics I'm reading about are scary. And if you've read anything about there, you know it's out there. So take and talk to them. Get over the embarrassment of it all. I talk very openly and frankly with my children, 12 and 13 years old. They're like, Dad. And I say, well, hey, you're going to hear about it anyway. Because I wanted them to hear it from me. I want them to know what God says. And I'm encouraging you because all their friends are going to be talking about it now for the next 6 weeks. So here's a great chance. Let them talk to you about it. Let's go through this together. Number 1 is this. Write this down. There is nothing new under the sun. This is one of my favorite passages of the Bible because it just describes about every single generation there ever was. Solomon, who you know, gained great wisdom as a gift from God because of the reason that he asked, I want wisdom to guide the people of Israel. God was pleased with that request and gave him greater wisdom than any man ever had other than Jesus Christ. And in that wisdom, Solomon will write many things. The book of Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite. It's probably written in Solomon's later life, where Song of Solomon is probably written when he's younger. This one's written when he's much older, and he's reflecting back on life. So, Ecclesiastes 1:9, though, says this. What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. He was saying, don't ever think that you're the first person to discover anything. Whether it be an immoral thing or a moral thing, don't think you're the first person. Here's the subpoint to that. Sexual problems are not new to your generation, regardless of what generation you're in. Whether you're a baby boomer or an X-generation person like me or a millennial or whatever the generations are that we name as they come out there, or an unnamed generation, it does not matter. We seem to always think that we are the first generation to discover sex. We're the first generation to discover problems in there. But that is not true. Solomon is telling us nothing is new, and your generation is not new. In fact, let me go through the Bible, the very first book of the Bible, and walk through just the sexual content that is in there and just see if you think you're the first. In Genesis 1, we have the distinction of genitalia. It says that God made them male and female. These were sexually descriptive words. I'm going to talk about that a little bit on. And so when we think about the issue of gender identity, like we're dealing with that now, I'm like, no, it was there in the very, very beginning. God talked about it. There's a definite difference between men and women. In Genesis 2, we have God's command for intercourse. We think, oh, we're the first ones to have discovered this. But in Genesis 2, it tells us, be fruitful and multiply. That is what God is talking about there. By Genesis 4, we have the problem of polygamy, where it says that Lamech took for himself 2 wives. By Genesis 9, we have the issue of nakedness of Noah being exposed and his sons mocking it. And so now we have sort of a stigma being attached to that was not there back in the garden when it talked about Adam and Eve, that they were naked in the garden and they both felt no shame. Now we have shame being attached to it. By Genesis 19, we have the town of Sodom desiring to engage in homosexual activity with the two angels that were sent there to rescue Lot's family, though the town did not know they were angels, thought they were just two men traveling in. Later on in Genesis 19, we have the issue of incest with Lot's daughters getting him drunk to have sex with him so they can continue on their lineage. And that caused a whole issue of problems in the history of the nation of Israel. By Genesis 34, we have men unable to control their sexual desires, and they rape Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, in the Shechemite story. You know that. By Genesis 38, we have prostitution taking place and another ancestral relationship with Judah and his daughter-in-law Tamar, who he thought was just a temple prostitute. And there was a play on the words there of prostitution. By Genesis 39, we have a woman, Potiphar's wife, who's now lusting after a man, and she's desiring to force him into a sexual act. And you know that Joseph flees, leaving his coat behind. And it just continues to get more and more as it's webbed throughout the Bible. So if you think that your generation is the first generation to deal with sexual problems, you're wrong. There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, the second thing I want to say is this. Sex is not evil, it is not nasty, and it is not wrong. It's going to throw me off a little bit there. I don't know where to go with that now. Yeah, it's not evil, it's not nasty, and it's not wrong. You know, I kind of grew up where it seemed like that's the way it was because it wasn't talked about in the church. So if it's not talked about in the church, it must be wrong. It must be evil. It must be something that's reserved for dark alleys and red light district kind of thing. But that's not true. First point I want to say about it is this, that God designed us to be sexually distinctive. God designed us to be sexually distinctive. In Genesis 1:27, it says this, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." Now, when we read this in the English, we don't think much about it. We just think, okay, he's created them. He's created man and woman, it's male and female. But in the Hebrew words here, the male and female words here are very visual words. The Hebrew language has a visualness attached to its language, to its words that describe that. The Greek language has things that are attached to its words to give greater depth and meaning to that. We lose some of that sometimes when we translate. The word zakar here, translated as male, means, you can do a word study on this, it means to remember or to be marked so as to be recognized. One definition says it like this, as being the most noteworthy sex. And I'm not going and making that like one sex greater than the other or that sort of thing there. I don't really think that's where it's going. The idea is this, that there is something that sticks out about that person that defines them. And yes, the pun is intended. This word here is saying there's something that is special about this person that sticks out. It's talking about male genitalia here. The idea was that when you would look at them, you would clearly tell this is male as defined and as opposed to being female. And the man, the idea why this idea of being remembered is attached, the thought is that when a man would see himself, he would remember that he's a male, made in the likeness of Adam and in the image of God. There was no way to be confused about who he was and how God had created him. Now, on the female side of things, the word negabah, it means one who is perforated or punctured. Clearly, the description implies the receptivity that is in continuity with the female anatomy. My point of all this is to simply say this, God has made us physically unique, and the language describes it. Our maleness and our femaleness is clearly seen in our outward sexual appearance, and God has made us that way. You think about it when a young baby is born. You would not be able to tell if a baby is a boy or girl if you just look at the color of their eyes, if you look at the size of their ears, or how much hair is on their head. That's not what we do. We go 10, 10, and 1, it's a guy, 10, 10, and none, it's a girl. I mean, that's what we do. And so the idea is God has created us that way, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's not evil. It's not nasty. It's not wrong. Now, point number 2 is this. God has also commanded us to be sexually active. Now, before you take this too far and say, well, that's it, preacher said I can be sexually active. That is not what I'm saying, okay? Let's read the text. Let's go back to the rule book. Genesis 1:28, it says this, God blessed them and he said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living creature that moves on the ground. God is telling them, I want you to go and I want you to engage in sexual intercourse. That's what this text is about. What do you think he means when he says be fruitful and increase in number? It's not like they're going down to the local Costco and buying a set of children, okay? So this is what we're talking about here. Don't take this verse out of context. Got to lighten it a little bit, you know. Don't take the verse out of context. This applies to the male and female relationship here. We're talking about the union of Adam and Eve. When God makes this statement, that's all there is. There's only two of them. They are committed to each other. There's no one else to be compared to. There's no one else to join in this act. There's no one else to bring a vileness to all this. And the point is that God commands them to engage in the act of sexual intercourse in the proper situation, and it should not be seen as evil or wrong. And yet we have somehow made it that way because we're afraid to say the words. Let me just go really out on a limb. And I heard Chuck Swindoll. I figured if he can say it, I can say it. Chuck Swindoll was preaching about this issue, and he's on the radio and writes books. And Chuck Swindoll said God made the sexual organs just as much as he made sexual orgasm. We're afraid to say that. We're like, oh, I can't believe the preacher would say, well, Chuck said it first, okay? The point is, these are all parts of the sexual act, and we don't want to talk about them. But God has created them, and we should talk about them in the context in which they belong. All right? Point number 3 is this. God saw his creation, including sex, as very good. It is very, very important to understand the order in which things are said in the Scripture. Because in verse 28, God says, be fruitful and multiply. The act of sex. In verse 31, it says that God saw all that he had made, and it was very good, and there was evening, there was morning on the 6th day. After everything is created, after the command to be sexually active, after the command to populate and produce offspring, God then says, this is very good. That tells me that everything included, including the act of sex, is something good, and God saw as something being very good. And for us to take it and make it something other than that is wrong. Is wrong. Point number 4. God has a purpose for sex. Now, as I read through here, let me give you at least 3 that I see from Scripture. Number 1 is this, and that is to produce offspring. Right? To produce offspring. I understand that not every sexual encounter is going to produce a child. You know that, I know that. I mean, biology tells us that. I know that not everyone's able to do that. I understand that there's all sorts of circumstances that come involved with that because we live in a fallen world that has frustrations, as the Bible says. There are things that go against the natural order in which God has created them. But God has given us sex to produce offspring. Genesis 28, I already read it. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Okay? Number 2 is this. For the mutual pleasure of the husband and wife. If you've ever read anything like about the Puritan movement and people along that lines, they had this mindset that like sex is only for one purpose, and that is to have a child. And other than that, we don't engage in it. And we've brought that on down through the years. I shared this morning. Michelle and I, we used to think this way and kind of joke about a little bit about her mom, her grandmother, and her grandfather in their 90s and stuff like that. And we used to talk, and her grandfather was real funny and whatnot. But we used to say, well, we know they had sex one time because they had Nancy, an only child. So that we used to say that, you know. And I'm not talking about what their sex life was like, but I understand this. It's not just for having a child. You know that, and I know that if you're married, there's pleasure that's involved in this. Now, let me read a Bible passage to tell you how I know that to be true. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 18 and following, it says, may your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that text, it doesn't seem to me like it's saying, let's just have a child. It seems to me like that what they're saying is, I am enjoying you and you are enjoying me. And it's clearly in a sexual content here. So all I'm saying is that it's not wrong to say that we enjoy this as a husband and wife in a marriage situation because God has given it to us to enjoy. Number 3 is this. For intimacy in the marriage relationship. For intimacy in the marriage relationship. It's not to say that you can't have intimacy without this. But if you're married, you know what I'm about ready to say. There's no greater intimacy that you will ever experience with an individual than the moment that you experience intercourse with somebody. The moment that you lay naked with another person, they lay naked with you, and you engage in the act of sex, you are never more vulnerable than at that moment. Someone tell me I'm right. I'm right. You know I'm right. Genesis 2:24 says this, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And the man and woman were both naked, and they felt no shame." Now, we've talked about this one flesh. We've preached it as preachers, and we talk about there's a oneness to our life. There's a oneness to our spirituality. There's a oneness to our emotional connection. There's a oneness to all these other things. We don't like to talk about the oneness of the physical, but that is also included in this text here. And all I'm saying is that when that act occurs, there is an intimacy within that act that cannot be experienced in any other relationship that we have in this earth. It can't be experienced in any other way. And so when there's a divorce, when a boyfriend or girlfriend have sex and they break up, that's why there's such anger there, because you have been violated in such a way. You have laid yourself out to a person in such a vulnerable state that they have now taken that and just chucked it to the wind. They've tossed it to the streets. And that's why those things are so incredibly hard to recover back from. So to produce offspring for mutual pleasure and for intimacy in the marriage. Now, let me move to point number 3. Every good thing must have boundaries. Every good thing must have boundaries. Now, here's my first point. Boundaries do not take away from the experience, but rather they enhance it. We like to think, oh, man, if there are rules, it's just a bummer. But that's not true. So let me put this in an illustration that everybody here is going to understand. I put it in terms of a sporting event, and I'm going to use football because that's the only sport I really played in high school. Let me just tell you, if you play football, if there are no referees, if there are no rules, if there are no boundaries, if there's no end zone markings, if there's no yard line markings or anything like that on the field, let me ask you, how fun would the sport of football be? It would just be chaos. Let me tell you what would never happen. How would you know if you've ever scored a point? There's no end zone to cross over. How would you know if you've ever gone 10 yards and now you can get a new first down? How would you know if a catch is either inbounds or out of bounds? How would you know if someone was offsides or not? How would you know when it's time for the ball to change hands? You wouldn't know any of those different things that make the game interesting. But when you have a referee that says the ball stopped here and they only made it 9 yards and therefore the ball is now going to change hands, or he says his foot was in bounds and he had control of the ball because he was on this line, and so the catch stands, or he got across the end zone and within the boundaries, and so now he has achieved points, and so his team is now up in points over this other team and now winning. You see, when you take the boundaries out and you take the rules out, the game is chaos. But when you put the boundaries in and the rules in, the game becomes fun. Now, the same is true when it applies to sex. God has not given boundaries to ruin your good time. He is not a cosmic killjoy, but rather he wants the best for you. And he knows that the best sex is not just to do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want, however you want. He knows that the best sex is within the boundaries that he has laid out. So point number 2 is this: God's boundaries for the sexual relationship. What are they? Let me give you them. Number 1 is this: it is a one-man, one-woman game. It is a one-man, one-woman game. It's not 1 man and 5 women. It's not 5 women and 6 guys. It's not 2 men. It's not 2 women. It's none of those other things. It is a one-man, one-woman game. Genesis 1:24, for this reason, a man, singular, will leave his father and mother and be united to his singular wife, singular. 1 man and 1 woman. Number 2 is this: there must be a marriage agreement. There must be a marriage agreement. In Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2, listen to what the Apostle Paul says. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, if you don't know anything about the town of Corinth, let me help you out and put it in a visual picture you can understand. Corinth is like modern day Las Vegas, okay? Sin and sex and immorality is rampant. It is everywhere. And Paul understands that. And he's talking to Christians and he's saying, you know what? You're going to be sitting in this town and you're going to have all this stuff all over the place. Nudity, homosexuality, brothels, prostitution, temple prostitution, all these different things here. And Paul knows that seeing all of that stuff is going to entice a desire that God has built within us. And so Paul says, then we need to put that desire in a proper location. Then each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And notice what he says here. He uses the term wife and husband. These are married terms. He doesn't say every man should just go get a lady and every lady should just go get a man. He uses the term wife and husband, which is indicating that there's a marriage relationship here. I don't care what our society is saying or doing or going down there. If there isn't a ring on the hand and promises and vows made, do not engage in this. And it doesn't matter if you're 17 or 67. We seem to think it's all 17-year-olds, but that's not true. I've talked honestly with more grown adults who are engaging in premarital sex than I have teenagers. It's everywhere. Number 3, your sexual activities are between you and your spouse, not the guys in the bar, not the girls at the club. It is not for you to be talking about to someone else and sharing with someone else. It is an experience that's meant to be between you and your spouse and nobody else. There are no third parties to be brought into this relationship. Proverbs 5:15 and following read like this. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets or your streams of water in the public square? Let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. Now I know that's poetic language and we think, oh, that's poetic language. Well, that's sort of like Old Testament stuff put to a song today. We would hear this kind of stuff in a song. And this is put to poetic language, but the point is very clear. The point is that your sexual activities are not to spill out into the streets. It's not for everyone to see. It's not for everyone to be a part of. It's not to be shared with everyone. It's to be shared with just you and your spouse. But we let this just spill out into the streets. Let me tell you a personal example of this. I knew a gentleman that I was working with in the Marine Corps who videotaped him and his wife having sex, brought it into the office and shared it with the guys in the office. Now, who does that kind of stuff? That is not how it's supposed to be. That's what he's talking about. Your sexual activities between you and your spouse. It's not to be talked about to the other guys. It's not to be shared with the other girls. Now, I'm not talking about where you confide with someone else about issues of intimacy and things that are going on. We all need some of that. But there are boundaries that need to be understood within there. Number 4 is this. And I'm talking primarily, well, I am talking to married individuals here. But if you're single, listen up. There is no room for selfishness in the bedroom. There is no room for selfishness in the bedroom. Listen to what the Apostle Paul once again says to the Corinthian church. In verse 3 of chapter 7, he says, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have the authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Paul is clearly saying here, stop thinking about yourself when it comes to sex. You need to be thinking about your spouse. What is it that brings them pleasure? What is it that's comfortable for them? What is it that brings intimacy to them? What is it that brings a closeness to them? It isn't all about you. If they're thinking the same way, the experience is going to be enjoyable. But if only one of you is just thinking all about yourselves, or if both of you are thinking all about yourself, the experience is always going to be lacking, and you can tell. You can tell. Paul says, let there not be a selfishness here. Think about your spouse, and your spouse think about you. Number 5 is this. God determines what is moral and immoral when it comes to sex. God determines what's moral and immoral when it comes to anything, but especially when it comes to this issue. So I do not care what the buddies say in the locker room. I don't care what the girls talk about when they just got done reading 50 Shades of Grey. I don't care what the judges have passed, some law, and what they say. I don't care what Congress says is okay. God determines what's moral and immoral, period. Now, let me go to Leviticus chapter 18. I don't have time to read the entire text. You can read that on your own, but the Leviticus chapter 18 is a whole grouping of relationships that are in violation of God's will for the sexual relationship. But let me boil them down to 5 areas. You can write these down. We try to leave extra space to write extra notes there. Number 1 is this: he forbids incest. There's a whole series of stuff that's going on in there. He talks about relationships not between just parent and child, but between close relatives. And there's 4 or 5 different ways, and he describes them all out. Your father's wife and your brother's sister and all these different things here. But the point is, he forbids it. Now, people would say, well, what about like back in the beginning with Adam and Eve? Yes, in Adam and Eve, that clearly was that they were given brothers and sisters in marriage to populate the earth. But by the time Leviticus comes around, God makes this law. He makes this mandate, and he never ever goes back on that from this point forward. And the reality is, it probably was actually fading out even before Moses gets the law, because population had grown by then. Number 2 is this: he forbids homosexuality. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what popular opinion says. I don't care what social media says. I don't care what your buddies say, a friend, whatever. God forbids homosexuality. Now, I'm not saying we got to hate these people. I'm not saying that. We're going to deal with that issue in the upcoming weeks, but I am saying this. God says that that relationship is an immoral relationship. Number 3, he forbids adulterous affairs. This is promiscuity. Sex is between one man and one woman in a marriage relationship. It's between nobody else. If there's no marriage relationship, there should be no sex. If there's a marriage relationship, it's just that spouse. We don't bring someone else. We don't engage in the swinger lifestyle. We don't bring in some third party just to spice things up or something like that. We don't go searching into another field. We don't draw water from another well, to use the Bible terminology here. Number 4, he forbids sex with animals. We call it bestiality. It's written there in the text. God says it's an abomination. Number 5, respect a woman's cycle. You can go through that whole section there in Leviticus 18, and there's a whole list of prohibitions that God has against sex. Now, let me wrap all of this up this morning as Mark comes with our song team. Let me kind of boil everything down a little bit by saying this: that sex is a good thing. It's a pleasurable thing. It's a God thing. But man has taken this wonderful thing and he has used it for evil. He has used it in an immoral way. And I just kind of listed out some vilenesses that have come from the way man has taken sex and what they've turned it into. Let me just tell you 10 things that came to mind. Now we have the one night stand thing. And you could group that in with like the, friends with benefits, we call like that. Sounds nice and cliche and, a little catchy and whatever, but we know what we're talking about. We're talking about no commitment. I just get to have some physical pleasure. We have affairs that have broken up family units and all of the damage that has come from that. Nobody wins in those situations. Pornography that has made men and women simply objects of sexual desire. We have the sex trade industry where young men and women, where young girls and young boys are being kidnapped and sold on the black market, forced to engage in sexual relationships. In fact, I read a statistic just this week that said over 50,000 young people in America are kidnapped and taken into the sex trade industry every year. Over 50,000 just in America alone. It's huge in India. I was talking to them in India about that, and they're taken down into the brothels and stuff like that where people don't talk about, but it happens. Sold overseas. Homosexuality that is not only accepted but praised and now even sanctioned by the highest court in our land. We have incest and the destruction of innocence. We have rape and the violence against women. We have child molestation, pedophilia, and the list could go on and on and on about all the bad things that have happened because we have taken this genie out of the bottle, out of the boundaries, and just thrown it to the winds and said, oh, everything's fine, everything goes, everything is okay. The point is clearly made. Our world has corrupted a wonderful gift And it's time that we teach our children the truth about sex. It's time that we stop being embarrassed to talk about it. It's time that we encourage everyone to honor God's boundaries about it. It's time that we take back the issue of sex and place it back in the marriage relationship and honor it in the way that God intended for it to be. Because when it comes to sex, He has something to say about it. In fact, He has a lot to say about it, and it's time that we listen to what He has to say about it. Now, let me just stop and say two things. I'm going to talk to the young people, since you happen to be standing over here or wherever you are. Do not get caught up in what the world is saying about sex. Do not think, well, it's just so much fun and I don't want to wait anymore. Do not give in to the temptations. Do not get sucked into the pornography cycle. Do not abandon your virginity. It is something that you only have to give away one time. And when you do, and it's not in a marriage committed relationship, and you finally get married, you will always be thinking, am I being compared to somebody else? And how am I measuring up? And what are they thinking about in that most intimate moment? It cannot possibly be away from your mind, and you can never get that back. God wants a great thing for you, but He wants you to wait and put it in the right perspective. Now, let me talk to the adults here. Start talking to your family about this. Start talking to your children about it. Because if you are not, the media is. Their friends are. Someone else is talking to them about it, and they will skew their thinking and skew their mindset on this issue, and we have the world in which we have today. And if you have violated these things, or you are violating these rules of God, then stop it. Get out of the relationship. If you're living with someone, if you're shacking up, or however you want to call it, friends with benefits, I don't care, stop it. It's not honoring to God. You cannot live a godly life and be engaged in such a thing. You cannot expect the favor of God to be on your life and openly live in such a way. You start setting the example. You start setting the example for others to follow, for your children to follow. Now, on the bottom there of your outline, I already mentioned it, but I seriously mean this. Take and talk about these questions. I wrote out 4 questions. Shell and I thought about these questions together to help get the conversation started. Some of you are so afraid to talk to your children about this issue because you're afraid to say something. You're afraid to talk about anatomy. What if they ask me where they came from? What if they ask me how it happened? Well, tell them whatever is age appropriate. But if they're sitting in this audience right now, it means they're at least 6th grade and older, and by golly, they need to know about it. They need to know about it. They're already talking about it. Some of them are already engaged in it. And so we need to talk about it. Don't be embarrassed about it. I don't know where to go with that one. I thought it was like, bump, you know? I'm just telling you, take the time to talk about it because their friends are going to be talking about it. Here's a great opportunity for the church to be speaking on this issue from a God perspective. Don't just trust, well, the preacher's going to teach us all about sex. I'm not here to do that. You as a parent are here to educate your child about the facts of life. Tell them honestly about it. Prepare them for the world. Tell them about the bad things they're going to see. I talk very openly with my children about it. They get embarrassed and, oh, Dad, Mom, why are you talking about it? I said, look, how do you think you got here? All right? So talk about it with them and just lay it out and just let them know that it's okay to come and talk to you when they have questions. I'm begging you to do that. That's why our world is the way it is. My mom talked to him. I'll just tell you a personal story as I wrap this up. My mom talked to my brothers and I about this when I was the youngest of 3 boys, so I was probably in 1st grade because Jim would have been in like 3rd or 4th grade. My mom talked to us all about sex, explained that, where children come from. She talked about puberty. She talked about all those things. My dad never once spoke to my brothers about it. Not once. Dads don't do that. I talk to John. Michelle talks to Caitlin. You need to talk to your son. Wives, you need to talk to your daughters. Talk to them. Talk about this issue. Tell them God has something to say about it. Let's pray.